Malaysia just officially pulled the plug on its major trade agreement with the United States. They aren't pausing it and they aren't renegotiating. The trade minister plainly stated, "It is not on hold. It is no longer there. It is null and void." But here is the truly disastrous part for Washington. By leaving the agreement, Malaysia actually locked in a lower tariff rate than they had inside the deal. They essentially called America's bluff and won. Now, every single nation that signed a similar pact with Trump is paying very close attention. Malaysia just officially pulled the plug on its major trade agreement with the United States. They aren't pausing it and they aren't renegotiating. The trade minister plainly stated, "It is not on hold. It is no longer there. It is null and void." But here is the truly disastrous part for Washington. By leaving the agreement, Malaysia actually locked in a lower tariff rate than they had inside the deal. They essentially called America's bluff and won. Now, every single nation that signed a similar pact with Trump is paying very close attention. I have a background in computer science, and I use data analysis to spot underlying patterns in geopolitics and global economics. Let me break down exactly why Malaysia might just be the first domino to fall in the total collapse of America's trade leverage. Last fall, Malaysia signed a massive reciprocal trade pact with the U.S. at the ASEAN summit in Kuala Lumpur. Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim shook hands with Donald Trump on an agreement that slashed tariffs from an initial 47% down to 24% and eventually to 19%. In return, Malaysia handed over massive concessions, granting deeper market access, tweaking policies, and adjusting regulations specifically to benefit American corporate interests. But Malaysia wasn't the only one. Leading into 2025, Trump secured matching reciprocal trade frameworks with a massive roster of partners. The UK, the EU, China, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Argentina, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Bangladesh, and Switzerland. It is a huge list of countries. Each deal was built on the exact same playbook: swallow devastating tariffs or negotiate them down by surrendering to Washington's demands. Then everything changed on February 20th. The U.S. Supreme Court handed down a 6-3 decision declaring that Trump's tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or EPA, were entirely unconstitutional. Chief Justice Roberts pointed out that EPA doesn't even mention duties or tariffs, and no previous president had ever interpreted the law to claim that kind of sweeping authority. According to the Tax Foundation, over $160 billion in tariffs were collected using EPA. Suddenly, all of it was ruled illegal. Within a matter of hours, Trump scrambled to replace those voided tariffs with a flat 10% levy under Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act, applying it equally to every single country, regardless of whether they had a signed deal or not. Malaysia did the math. Stay in the deal and pay 19%, or leave the deal and pay the flat 10%. They chose the exit. If you've tracked Trump's recent efforts to pressure allies, even China, into helping out with the Iran situation, this pattern will look incredibly familiar. I'll drop a link to that video in the description, and you can see it on your screen right now, too. Every single trade pact Trump brokered relied heavily on the threat of EPA tariffs. Nations were staring down rates of 47%, 50%, or even higher. They swallowed a bitter pill, handing over hundreds of billions of dollars in market access, procurement rules, and purchase guarantees just to lower those specific numbers. But now EPA is dead. The replacement, Section 122, treats every nation identically, whether they bent the knee or not. Analysts are pointing out exactly why a mass exodus is imminent. Two major factors are driving countries toward the door. First, these deals offer zero economic benefit following the Supreme Court's decision. Nations like Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and the European Union had agreed to tariffs hovering around 15% to 20%, offering massive regulatory and market access concessions in return. But once the courts killed the reciprocal tariff strategy, Washington slapped a universal 10% tariff on all trading partners. This means nations with signed treaties are treated no better than those without one. As one source directly put, the preferential advantage promised by those agreements has therefore disappeared. Second, the bullying doesn't stop once the ink dries. On March 11th and 12th, the U.S. Trade Representative initiated two fresh Section 301 investigations aimed at 60 nations, including those that had already inked agreements. So countries gave up leverage, locked themselves into heavy obligations, and are still facing investigations over forced labor and excess manufacturing capacity. Just look at the domino effect currently unfolding. India was slated to finalize their treaty this very month. That deal demanded they purchase $500 billion in US goods over 5 years, wipe out tariffs on American agricultural and industrial products, and completely stop importing Russian oil. That is a massive commitment. But yesterday, India's Commerce Secretary confirmed they are holding off until Washington finalizes a brand new tariff structure. One senior official explicitly noted, any nation enters into an agreement only when it perceives a market advantage relative to other competing nations. Because of the flat rate, that advantage has completely vanished. Another Indian government insider was even harsher, labeling the fresh Section 301 probes a blatant coercion tactic meant to force nations into deals post-Supreme Court ruling, calling it a wrench in the gears. Over in Europe, the EU halted the ratification of the Turnberry Agreement back in late February. Bernd Lang, head of the European Parliament's Trade Committee, remarked that the primary leverage mechanism Washington used to negotiate the Turnberry deal simply doesn't exist anymore. He stressed that the landscape is incredibly uncertain, which completely undermines the stability and predictability they were hoping to achieve. When you've spent years analyzing finance, you start spotting massive tells like this. When several global players simultaneously stall, delay, or walk away from agreements that took months to hammer out, it's not a coincidence. It is a highly coordinated reassessment. Everybody is watching closely to see if Malaysia actually suffers any real consequences. Speaking of critical thinking, if you want to sharpen your ability to cut through political spin and uncover what is really happening in situations like this, my book, Awake, The Practice of Critical Thinking in an Age of Self-Lies, guides you through this exact analytical process. It's out on audiobook and ebook. Subscribers get a 10% discount, and you can grab the first chapter for free via the links in the description. Trump reacted to the Supreme Court's verdict with a furious threat. He warned that any nation trying to play games with a ridiculous Supreme Court ruling would be hit with tariffs far worse than what they originally agreed to, ending his Truth Social post with a stark buyer beware. At the India Today conclave, the U.S. ambassador issued a stern warning that Washington expects partners to honor their signed deals, the underlying implication being, back out and you will face consequences. But look at the actual weapons left in Washington's arsenal. Section 122 caps out at a maximum of 15% and automatically expires in 150 days unless Congress actively votes to extend it. That countdown ends right in mid-July, just months ahead of the midterm elections. Lawmakers would be forced to cast a recorded vote on tariffs right when voters are hyper-focused on consumer prices. The Brookings Institution highlighted that this forces House and Senate members to take responsibility for votes just months before the 2026 midterms. Meanwhile, those Section 301 probes, which Trump launched against 16 countries in mid-March, take a painstakingly long time to conclude. They demand highly specific industry-by-industry findings, evidence of unfair practices, and are extremely vulnerable to legal roadblocks. They aren't the instant, sweeping overnight threats anymore. And remember, the nations targeted include partners who already gave major concessions: Malaysia, India, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the EU. They locked into commitments, and they are still in the crosshairs. The power dynamic has entirely flipped before the court's ruling. Trump held the leverage, signed the deal, or face crushing tariffs. Now the partner nations hold the leverage. Why fulfill painful concessions when the initial threat doesn't even exist? Europe's energy crisis adds another complex dimension to this. Norway's emergence as an energy alternative actually explains why the EU feels emboldened to push back against Washington. You can click the video on your screen to see that breakdown. Moving forward, I expect 3 distinct scenarios to emerge. Scenario 1, more countries follow Malaysia's lead. Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Bangladesh all swallowed 15% to 20% tariffs alongside massive concessions. Now they face a flat 10% rate with absolutely nothing required. Expect a wave of quiet withdrawals over the next 60 days. Scenario 2, Trump tries weaponizing Section 301 to slam specific industries with tariffs, but those investigations will drag on 4 months and inevitably face legal challenges. The blunt instrument is effectively gone. Scenario 3, the 150-day timer, Congress either absorbs the political damage of extending Section 122 before the midterms, or the president's tariff authority just evaporates in July. Malaysia is the canary in the coal mine here. A smaller economy dared to test whether America would actually retaliate. The answer so far appears to be angry social media posts, but zero concrete action. Every trade minister on earth is taking notes. These agreements were entirely constructed on fear. The Supreme Court removed the threat. The moment the world realizes the emperor has no tariffs, the entire architecture collapses. This actually ties directly into a massive geopolitical shift happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now. Iran is strictly restricting safe passage only to vessels that trade in the yuan, which has profound implications for the US dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. That video is on your screen right now. I'll see you there.